Wow, this is just a pure joy because I'm here with my dear friend, Jeff Hamaoui, who is an extraordinary individual and is part of the Modern Elder Academy community with Chip Conley, and he's the co-founder of the community. He is the head of education and the head of community development down in the glorious Cabo San Lucas area, where they've created this incredibly vibrant, vital community. And just, I am so in awe. I've been down to the Modern Elder Academy. I've been blessed to serve as faculty down there, and it is an extraordinary experience.
Thank you, Danny. Yeah, it's been a crazy journey. The academy was founded by myself, obviously Chip Conley,
and yes, and Christine Sperber. And I, first of all, Christine, if you're listening, I love you as well. It's just and Chip, the inner heart of your team is extraordinary.
Thank you. So, and for everyone who doesn't know, this is Dr. Danny Friedland. For those on his channel, hello, thank you for having us. For those on our channel,
Yes.
You've heard of Danny, you've seen him around. He's both taught and he's done discussions with Chip and so on and so forth. But I think this session is we're going to sort of really dial it into some of the work that we've been focusing on, Danny, here at the Academy, with my partner, Carrie Henley, who's running our online course, and our broader team, who's really thinking about transitions in midlife. I think in terms of the wider context, we're in the middle of a pandemic. The world itself is in serious transition. Our transitional skills, our ability to manage and navigate transitions are increasingly being called on. And as we live longer into our midlives, as we live longer into our lives, the question is there a mastery? Is there a sort of a transitional quotient that we might be able to develop to face whatever transitions life sends us, whether they're personal or professional or physical, or indeed in the most powerful cases like the ones you're facing yourself, a transition of passing away, the transition of coming face to face with death. I know that for many that's kind of going to be a shock to hear, but on November 12th of last year, you were diagnosed with stage 4 brain cancer.
Yeah.
And Danny, I think, it's so interesting. I think, the thesis that we have around transition is that you can either have a transition that's regressive, where you go back to old behaviors, old patterns, maybe victimhood, maybe whatever it happens to be, or regenerative transitions. And I know you talk a lot about generative thinking and generative transitions. So I think in the face of this, in the face of this diagnostic, you and your family are going through this point in your lives where you had to make a choice between who you were in the face of this incredible challenge, right?
Yeah.
Tell us where you landed.
Well, I landed by leaning in. And there's a framing concept for this. This is the active learning cycle by Kolb on experiential learning. And essentially, it's about whether or not we lean into our active learning cycle through transitions, or we actually get plucked out of this. So when I got my diagnosis of brain cancer, I went into a period of deep reflection. And there are questions that actually automatically come up in reflection that are survival based. The brain's first premise is safety and survival.
Yep.
So the natural questions that come up is why me, why now, what, and every catastrophe that could happen. That's, a natural default way that the brain actually engages in transition. And those questions, David Cooper-Ryder, who founded Appreciative Inquiry,
Yeah.
that questions create worlds, and our default questions typically take us into a world of suffering. And so the generative questions, which require cultivation, leads us into a world of flourishing. And the gateway into that is mindfulness. It's being mindfully aware of what questions you're seeding in your brain. And so I found through my mindfulness practice, I found a miraculous question. And instead of why me, I asked what matters most now. And essentially that led me into a generative type of reflection. Mm-hmm. And there's an attitude of reflection, there's a form of reflection. So the attitude of reflection is, first of all, taking ownership. Yeah. Taking ownership for your experience, taking full ownership for your experience, and then leaning in with a sense of openness and a sense of it allowing.
So the question I have for you is, when you use language like taking ownership for your experience, yeah. I need you to slow down and start. Imagine I'm there. Imagine it's me in that room. Yeah. And I've hit that sort of pit of despair, right? Yeah. I'm in victimhood. I'm feeling like, why me? This is so unfair. This is so terrible. I feel like sometimes people like you, you've got such a sort of a density of experience in this work that you sometimes don't even realize what it is that you've done. So I want you to anatomize it. I want you to sort of say, okay, what does taking ownership for your experience actually mean to a normal human being who is collapsing under the weight of something like this?
Yeah. Ooh.
How do I do it?
Yeah. So I just want to put myself back to be able to do that. You know, I just want to transport back to that moment when I was lying. You know, I want you to imagine that you're in my body, that I've just been admitted to the wards after getting been given a diagnosis, and I'm going to the wards alone because it's COVID precautions.
Yep.
I'm lying in bed, and what's going through my default brain is all those scary questions. I'm feeling incredibly alone and in deep fear. I've got fear spikes raging.
Yeah.
So there's a pivot point, and I want to just, you know, get into that kind of like, get into talking about, you're talking about transitions. You know, there are long-term transitions, but then there are these moment-to-moment transitions. There's that flip between, there's the transition between deep pain and suffering and fear into something else, into an alternative possibility. Yes. There's that transition. It's a micro transition. That micro transition leads into a macro transition. But there's that moment of transition. So let's see if we can plumb into that, like literally into that pragmatic moment of what is that magical moment.
Yeah.
And that magical moment is, you know, it's not a should. It's like I should take ownership. It's a revelation that you can take ownership. It's a revelation of capacity. And the revelation of capacity comes from the noticing. It comes from an awareness, you know, the gateway to the gateway. So Viktor Frankl's famous quote is, between stimulus and response, there's a gap. In that gap is your power to choose. Now that gap is the gap of being able to actually distinguish between your suffering and your ability to notice your suffering. That's the transition. It's the moment you catch yourself in the noticing of your suffering rather than being swept away by your suffering. That's the micro transition. And then what emerges is the possibility of choice and recognizing that you have not only choice, and I think the sense of ownership comes after that. It's almost like an awareness of capacity that invests you in your ownership.
Yeah. So, and again, you're in that fear, you're in that loneliness, your body's doing all kinds of craziness to your brain as well, right?
Yes.
There's all sorts of hormonal activity and
Yes.
right. How are you not, do you not allow yourself to go into that?
No, so
You
actually
live that.
So the reason why I started out with the active learning cycle. So if I come back to this,
Yeah.
literally you're running micro experiments. You're running micro experiments. So I'm noticing, and this actually happened also when I got my formal diagnosis. That night that I got my, it was 2 weeks later, the PAP came back and I knew I had grade 4 glioblastoma. So it was the same thing. I had this experience on both nights, and then I started running experiments. The first night I would say was an informal experiment, but then I actually ran these experiments more proactively. I wanted to know what actually caused me energetic contraction. I wanted to feel what caused me energetic contraction versus what caused me energetic expansion. And so I voted with my feet initially on the first night. I noticed that when I asked the question, why me? What if, what's going to happen to my family? I noticed that I felt contracted. But then when I asked the question, what matters most now? I actually felt an energetic shift in my body within 5 to 10 seconds. So I knew I was tracking in that transition, an expansion. And I knew that gave me a signal that I'm on the right path. And I also retrospectively, I know that questions have altitude. I had asked a great question because when I asked the question, what matters most now? That leads into a cascade of questions that touches down with something pragmatic. It's all in the stream of appreciation. So what matters most now leads to the question, naturally, when time is running short, there's only one answer that makes sense. Make every moment count.
Yeah.
And that leads into the next question, which is how. And I got 2 answers back by that. Live intensely loving relationships. And then the how of that was in cycles of receiving and giving love. And then the other part was leave a legacy with my work.
Yeah. We'll get to that. And I want to get to your family as well in a while and how you bring other people with you in transition, but not quite yet. I want to explore a question, and it's a competency question, Danny. You're the author of a book called Leading Well from Within. And this has been this idea of being able to sort of mine your own depths, notice yourself, and bring that into your everyday action, sort of connect to your community, connect to purpose, connect to sort of the greater well-being. This has been a practice for you. I think you described this moment by moment transition between fear and sort of the loneliness of your diagnosis into this generative question, what's most important now, and into this sort of unfolding. I think for many people that could actually be an endless journey to just make that thing that you were able to do from a moment to a moment might take someone a lifetime or what remains of their life to get there. Do you think that the work that you had done had equipped you with that kind of transitional intelligence, that a transitional mastery to allow you to move more effectively into that generative question?
Yeah, I think when many people look at their life path. Now, you've got a remarkable community. The people that invest in the Modern Elder Academy community have been already on a journey. and they're self-selected in because you're all on your journey.
Yep.
And when you look at that journey, have already been multiple transitions on that journey. So, my earlier transition, when I look at my early days, when I arrived here from South Africa as a young man, I was, very conflicted leaving South Africa because of just, I left during the height of apartheid. At the same time, while I had a sea of restlessness, I also had gone through some experiences where I thought that the pathway of mastery was one to get to a place where you overcame your self-doubt. So I actually developed, as a young man, a certain level of arrogance and ego. And then I went into medical school and I completely fell apart. So that was one of my big transitions. Yeah. And I went into my first clinical depression. I, overwhelmed with stress and burnout, and I hit the wall. And so my first part of my transition was I didn't even know, because I thought I'd come to a place of mastery where I lived the delusion that I didn't have self-doubt for a period of time, but it ran the show as an undercurrent. So my first part, one of my first revelations was when I was in the blessing of a clinical depression. So sometimes, we're terrified by, depression and going into the belly of the beast. But that has been my experience. That has been the greatest gift of transformation, because, you can choose transformation, or, you enter the belly of the beast and you have to transform. Otherwise, you can't keep going down that rabbit hole. So for me, in that, my first revelation was I became aware that actually what was running the show was my fear of self-doubt. And with that revelation came a branch point: what now? What now? So, so instead of kind of like, why me? The question, what now? is so much more powerful at that transition point. And so the what now question at that moment in my life led me into the question, how do I embrace self-doubt? Instead of going back to trying to overcome it, how do I embrace self-doubt so I can actually create a meaningful life with it? And that led me into seeking for skills and practices, which led me into the search for practices that led me to cultivating a mindfulness practice. Mm-hmm. So it's these periods of transitions in our life that are unfolding that have set me up. So yeah, so certainly in writing the book, Leading Well from Within, which is a science and practice of conscious leadership, which goes into the skills and practices of navigating stress and focusing on what really matters, I'm well equipped. And yet I have I've claimed so much ground since because of this that's prepped me for this. And another part of the story was I've been doing certification through the exchange approach that incorporates appreciative inquiry. And so that gave me the form of the generative question. So I was primed for that question. I was primed for noticing, am I asking a question in the stream of depreciation or the stream of appreciation? So I was primed for the awareness of not only the awareness of my suffering, but for the awareness of the questions that could actually add to my suffering or add to my flourishing. So I had that skill set.
I had never placed appreciative inquiry as this sort of core transitional skill. So thank you. That is a really profound learning for me. The other thing I want to reflect back, Danny, the other thought that I want to reflect back is that better question, that generative question or the regenerative question, doesn't take away the darkness. It doesn't take you out of the belly of the beast. You're still in there. You still have to go through that, but you go through it with a different mindset. Is that fair to say?
Yes. So this is core, because the attitude of questions is openness, kindness, and curiosity. And there's a certain presence, and you anchor to purpose. So the kindness, the self-compassion, there's a certain quality of meeting your experience. So one of the experiments that I ran when I was in my deep grief response of getting my formal diagnosis, I ran the experiment. What I found myself saying, it is what it is. It is what it is. So in other words, it's meeting your reality with a sense of presence without the resistance of it. So the openness and the allowing is, a lot of pain and suffering comes from resistance. So there's an initial allowing yourself to meet your experience with what it is. And then the kindness piece, integrating that, is there's an element of nuance in this. And what the self-compassion does, it brings a kindness to the experience. So you have a mindful awareness of your suffering. You're now inclining with kindness, but you're inclining in a specific way. You're not inclining. There's a temptation to think that you can actually use kindness to shift the reality away, to push. And actually, Kristin Neff speaks really eloquently. Kristin Neff she's one of the key thought leaders on self-compassion, and she actually speaks about this concept of backdraft. And what she says is that there's an initial experience where you have this feeling that you can actually have mastery with self-compassion, but that mastery, the illusion of that mastery, is not mastery, but it's really kind of like a sense of trying to bury your pain and suffering with self-compassion. So there's almost like it's another form of resistance. And when you actually go and move into that, what actually happens is the suffering for a period of time begins to actually explode. So it actually, you're leaning into self-compassion, but then the suffering explodes further. And so the idea over here is we're not using our suffering to move into artificial harmony. You're moving it to engage in a softening around the suffering, if that makes sense.
Yes.
So we're being more present with it. And what you're saying really resonates, Jeff. We're not ignoring, we're leaning into what is with a softening. And from that place, we can begin to ask with curiosity the generative questions that lead us into growth and flourishing.
And the challenge with these transitions, whether they are these life-defining transitions like the one you're going through, or even just regular transitions, is they're sort of in a Russian doll, right? They're sort of nested within other people as well. So you have two young sons, you have a wife who are close and, in this with you in a very profound way. How, and again, I know there's the inspiring story, but functionally, once you've been able to take this step that sort of leans into a better question, how can you bring your family, who perhaps don't have these practices, these skills, these experiences, even these beliefs, and maybe your family does because they're your incredible family, but again, sort of imagine that someone's trying to learn from you. How can I bring my family, especially when they're like, no, this is a disaster, Dad. This is killing me.
Well, the blessings of this is that, in this Living Well from Within YouTube channel that our family has created, and we purposefully did that. That was part of my commitment to wanting to leave a legacy with my work. And I could have done this YouTube channel alone, my own personal journey. I wanted to do this as a family project, so we could actually all be engaged in this active learning cycle together. And that's been glorious because you can see my family's journey in real time how they've gone through extraordinary growth and learning. And because certainly on November 12th, when I learned my diagnosis, that morning, infinite health and possibility. And then by that evening, I'd now walked through the doorway of cancer. If you're blessed to have a family, you don't walk through that doorway alone. You bring your family with you. And so initially you can imagine the grief response, the shock. My oldest son, Zach, was driving down from Santa Barbara. I had just told Sue and my youngest son, Dylan, and they were just shell-shocked and still processing. And then because Zach was driving on the road, I didn't want him to get distracted. We waited for him to get into literally by the gurney in my ER room. And when I told him, he could not believe it. He clutched the side of the gurney and collapsed. He collapsed and he just couldn't. And then he grabbed inside his shirt and he shredded his shirt off his body. In Judaism, there's a kriya thing where he just shred his shirt off, and he sobbed inconsolably for 30 minutes. And he collapsed. And at that moment, he said, "Dad, the rock," I felt like, when he processed this software, he says, I felt like you are my foundation, you are my rock. And I felt like I had lost the rock in my world. And literally he collapsed. So in many ways, that's a curriculum. The curriculum for our family was, for all of us right now, is how do you reassemble your rock, the foundation of your life, independent of flesh and blood? Independent of flesh and blood. Like, what else might serve as a rock inside your world, as a foundation inside your world? Where else can we find stability? And that has been a quest for me. And that has been a quest for all of my family, because that is, and I think, the greatest fear that we have, I think for many of us, is the fear of death, right? It's the fear of, and there are two elements of this. It's the fear of not only physical death, but more importantly, the fear of psychological death. And so the fear of physical death is simple. It's like, what happens when I take my final last breath? But there's a greater fear, which is the fear of psychological death, is the fear of living in validation that comes through the questions, am I good enough? It's the fear of self-doubt. It's the fear of self-doubt, because what if I discovered that I'm not worthy? I did research, because when I went through my tarot with self-doubt in medical school, I wanted to know, is self-doubt normal? So I did a study on self-doubt in San Francisco International Airport and discovered that we all have self-doubt. It's normal. So then I became very insatiably curious. Well, if it's normal, why do we fear it? And so I asked a series of questions. I asked the questions in the study. Did you feel you got more love and acceptance from your parents when you were successful than when you weren't? And then I asked the questions, do you feel people get more love and acceptance when they do things well than when they don't? And then I correlated that with self-doubt. The shorthand of that is, we're conditioned to fear self-doubt by our childhood conditioning. And so we land up with an implicit childhood contract if we're only being preconditioned to receive love and acceptance when we do things well, when we're successful, our internal acceptance becomes conditioned on external success. So the fear of self-doubt, so we have this implicit childhood contract. Many of us have this implicit childhood contract. I will only love and accept myself when I prove self-worth, which preconditions a terror in self-doubt, which is, if I discover I'm not worthy, I can't accept myself. That's the fear of living in validation. That's the fear of living in validation. And so people will actually, that fear drives such terror for many people that they will choose the comfort of physical death over the fear of living in validation. So it's whether it be the fear of psychological or physical death, that fear of death impedes the ability to live a fully flourishing life. So the curriculum becomes, how do we allow the fear of death to die itself so we can be born into a flourishing life?
Danny, let's go back to that sort of reassembling of the foundation, independent of flesh and blood. What are the clues you're finding as a family? How are you able to take that rock and replace it in the heart with something different?
Well, so for me, as my heart has opened, I always used to think that because a lot of my book has been about leading well from within, which is the science of conscious leadership. So there's a mindfulness element over here. But because I asked the generative question, that brought me into my heart space, which is a giving and receiving of love each and every moment. What's opened for me is just sensing the power of conscious leadership is when it's connected to an awakened heart. And then what that's done is that's allowed spirit to flow into my life with an extraordinary range of synchronicities. It's just been extraordinary. So what I'm experiencing right now is an answer to Einstein's greatest question, which is fundamentally, do you believe you live in a friendly or a hostile universe? And so I'm living into the experience of, I know and trust in my heart of hearts that the fabric of the universe is loving conscious energy. So that is for me my greatest comfort. I believe this with every fiber of my being. And I know that when we get into fear, there's a corruption of that, but I think that the distortion is hostility. The foundation is fundamentally a loving, conscious, friendly universe. Now that will re-architect your life, because when you have that core in your bones belief, I'm ready to merge. I'm living in that field right now. And I will dissolve into that. When my flesh and bones and whatever becomes of my consciousness melts away, I will actually still be in this field in some form. So that's why I have certain things dropping away right now. I've just been through 30 days of radiation therapy. So I'm losing my hair, but I've had my brain fried. I've literally had my brain fried. So I'm a little bit slower than, so I'm
noticeable.
So I'm having certain flesh and blood drop away right now, and when you actually look at what is your core essence, who are you? And you keep asking questions, who are we in essence? and you keep asking a question over and over and over again, we get into some really mystical realms.
Mm-hmm. We're running up on time, and I do have one last question, and again, I'm going to bring it back to something really practical. You've taught us how to sort of think about finding the generative question, even in the worst of times. You've taught us how we might do that through an attitude of reflection. You've said a little bit about, even within suffering, there's the possibility of choice, and that we need to embrace our self-doubt to create meaning, with openness, kindness, and curiosity. You said that to lead your family through this transition with you, you've actively engaged in learning together about this transition. You've actually used it as a learning and growth opportunity, and asked them better questions about reassembling the foundations of the heart. There are dark nights, Danny. I know there are. There are nights you wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and you find that fear again, and you find that doubt. If you could give advice to someone who's going through something similar, if you could give them counsel on how to stay this path, even through that fear, what would your final advice be?
Yeah, well, so Jeff, I would love to, I want to still come back to sharing that. So it's an orientation. What I mean by an orientation, where I find my comfort, because I trust the universe is conscious, loving energy. I know that I can turn away from, I can shut my heart out. And I also know that while I might do that, this conscious, loving energy is forever available to me. It won't shut itself off from me. So it's, how do we orient in this field? Mm-hmm. And what these generative questions do, they lead you into what they do is, when I ask a good question, when I ask a generative question, I actually find the comfort that naturally is afforded to me, because I'm simply asking a question in alignment with conscious, loving energy. So it's forever available for me. It's forever available to all of us, I believe. And it is what my pragmatic is to notice the questions that you're asking, is to begin to watch your mind and to actually have compassion for your mind. And even when you're noticing the questions of fear, be very cautious not to go into self-judgment about, I should be asking a different question, because all you're going to do is go into war with yourself, and that doesn't help. And so pragmatically notice that your brain is asking questions in its quest for survival. These are survival-oriented questions. And the best way we could actually, when you notice yourself asking, why me, why now, what if, instead of actually going into, I shouldn't be asking those questions, which is going to create resistance around those questions, just say to you might say to your brain pragmatically, thank you for trying to keep me safe. Thank you for trying to keep me safe. And then gracefully pivot to a more generative question. Thank you for trying to keep me safe. And then seed additional questions into that stream. Consciously seed, search for different questions that you could consciously seed into the stream, such as, what matters most now? If you're suffering, a pivotal question is, how can I better care for myself right now? How can I best comfort myself right now? What do I need right now? Claiming the ground of love and belonging, self-compassion, and then go from there into the larger questions. What does this mean for my life? But moving from, if you're in deep fear, just asking the simple question, what would provide me comfort right now?
And what was that object you showed us, Danny? Tell us about that.
Okay, so this is, you had asked me early on, how are we all making sense of, transition from flesh and blood into, merging with loving conscious spirit. So I had just completed delivering a 3-day workshop on awakening conscious leadership with the Exchange community with John Berghoff. We collaborated on this. This, was the finest, expression of, my leading well from within work because of that collaboration. And Zach and Dill went through the 3-day program. Mm. And the last exercise was a peer coaching process where I actually put people into pairs with asking generative questions around challenging issues. So Zach went into this experience with Loretta, and the challenge that he brought to bear was he asked the question, what happens when my dad dies? What happens when he's no longer flesh and blood? And so that was the curriculum he explicitly worked on. And so Loretta brought out an hourglass, and Zach said, when you said to him, Zach, when you look at this hourglass, what do you see? And Zach said, well, when we turn it over, what I'm most fearful about is I see time running out. That time is precious and time's running out for my dad. I don't know how long I've got to live with him. And so as he processed through this, the power of this metaphor is reflecting on what the sand means. And so when he reflected on what the sand means to him in this metaphor, the sand represents my flesh and blood and my time's running out. And so Loretta invited him to reconsider what other metaphor he could use, what else he could reflect on instead of flesh and blood being the sand. What else might he look at how else could he look at the sand? Mm-hmm. And what he realized was that if he looked as the sand, not as my flesh and blood, but my living spirit, that everything changes. That everything changes. Because I had told him, I had seeded him with the idea when, how can you reassemble? I said, Zach, what I wish for you most in your life is that you live a loving life. And that you live a loving life, loving your spiritual life, loving God. Because when I emerge, you will always find me in this field of loving spirit. And so, what he came to is that when you look at this hourglass where the sand represents spirit, it's not time running out. What it is, it's an infinite loop. Mm-hmm. Over and over again, it's infinite time. and he will always find me. I will always be present for him in the field of loving spirit. And then when he merges into that field, we will find each other and we will be connected to our generations past and our generations to also come.
And when we make our decisions from that place, when we ask our questions from that place, we connect to each other as well.
Exactly. So you find answers, you find the answers. He will always find me in the field of loving spirit, and part of that's embedded in his intuition, but he now trusts that he will be forever connected with me, and time isn't running out. It's infinite time. You know what's funny? I thought about this. This is just bringing you back to a place of lightness. When he was younger, his favorite super character, his favorite was Buzz Lightyear. Mm-hmm. And we always had this saying, Buzz Lightyear would say, "To infinity and beyond." So we had this thing. I would sign cards to him that, "Zach, I love you to infinity and beyond." And I'm seeing that's expressed most beautifully here. I'm going to mention this to him later today, to infinity and beyond.
Danny, what a beautiful note to end this recording. You are such a wonderful, wonderful human. I love you, my friend.
Oh, Jeff, I love you too, my dear, dear brother. And I feel so blessed that to be in your presence, and with Chip and Christine, and to be able to share with your extraordinary, loving community at the Modern Elder Academy, and with our community over here, Living Well from Within. It's just to be able to share in all of this with you.
Thank
we
you.
love you.
Loved you back.
Okay.
Okay. You're going to have to turn the recording off because I'm going to start crying any moment.
Love. Yeah.